Inevitably, if you take a class on recording, or even just read articles in the magazines, you'll come across the story of the Beatles' pioneering recording techniques employed on the Sgt. Pepper album, which was a watershed in multi-track recording in the mid-60s. They're always quick to point out that the rich sound and dense layering on that album was accomplished not with 24 or 48 tracks, like modern recordings, but with only 4-track recorders. Well, the Studer J37 4-track tape machine model here is the model used for those classic tracks, and Waves has tried to capture all the elements of the original hardware that contributed to the rich analog sound of the recordings made with it. But before I start going through the ins and outs of the plugin, here's a little background on the original. The 4-track Studer J37 model arrived at Abbey Road in 1965. It was the first multi-track from Studer, who went on to become one of the leading makers of multi-track recorders all throughout the heyday of analog tape. The J37 had an extended frequency response for its day, up to 18 kHz, and a warm sound thanks to the 52 tubes used for its electronics. Additionally, some specific design features regarding the record and playback amplifiers gave rise to the famous Abbey Road ADT effect, and I'll cover that when I go over the real ADT plugin. But of course, all tape recorders have technical limitations, imperfections like the wow and flutter that comes from the mechanical aspect of having motors pulling tape past the heads, and the gentle saturation that occurs when magnetic tape is slightly overloaded with signal. These aspects lend a distinctly analog quality to the recordings, and to capture them, Waves has not only reproduced the mechanical quirks of the J37, but even modeled several tape formulations that EMI developed in-house specifically for it. They even included some controls for creating the nicely thick delay and echo effects that tape recorders were often pressed into use for back then, and which are still preferred by many engineers, even today. All of these aspects of the J37's sound and operation can be controlled from the plugin's main panel, but before I jump in, I want to just for a minute touch on one recording technique closely associated with the J37 and the Sgt. Pepper album. That's sound-on-sound recording. If you're familiar with Sgt. Pepper, you might wonder, how did they get such complex arrangements with so many obviously overdubbed multi-track parts, with only 4 tracks to work with? Well, the answer is they had more than 4 tracks. The Beatles engineers and producer George Martin actually utilized 2 J37s and a recording technique called sound-on-sound. They'd record 4 tracks on one machine, and then all 4 tracks would be mixed down to 1 track of the second tape machine, in mono. They could then add 3 more overdubs and mix the resulting 7 tracks to a fresh tape reel back on the original machine. This process was repeated back and forth until they'd recorded all the tracks they needed for a particular arrangement. Obviously, they had to not only pre-plan the arrangement, but also commit to mix decisions like level and EQ as they did each transfer. It's a wonder they ever got anything done, let alone how good those recordings sound. Now, why bother mentioning this, other than as an interesting historical tidbit? Clearly, there's no need for this technique nowadays, or when using these plugins, which can be opened on as many tracks as you want. Well, I mention it to point out that whatever analog quality of warmth and presence the J37 contributed to the sound, it was increased by the multiple recordings and re-recordings done as part of the sound-on-sound process. So if you're wondering how much of this analog tape effect is appropriate and how much may be too much, keep in mind that there was quite a lot of analog tape artifact on those classic recordings. So don't be afraid that you're overdoing it if you like what you get when you give the J37 plugin a little extra push. If it sounds good when you drop it in the mix, then it is good. So let's take a look at what's on tap here. Next up, I'll do a brief primer on the non-linearities that give analog tape its unique sound, and then I'll start going through the J37 controls in detail.